Little girls screamed, "They're beating my mama." Mafia Boss said, "I'm on my way." The silence of the Caruso estate was more than a lack of noise, it was a physical weight, a carefully curated atmosphere of expensive mahogany and calculated terror. Sebastian sat behind his desk, the light of a single lamp catching the sharp, weathered planes of his face. He was reviewing a ledger that spelled out the life and death of a dozen businesses, his expression stone cold. To the world, he was a ghost. A myth of power who decided the fate of the city with a stroke of a pen. That silence didn't just break, it shattered. Outside the heavy oak doors, the muffled sounds of a struggle erupted, the frantic scuffle of shoes on marble, a panicked shout from an enforcer, and then, a sound that bypassed Sebastian's logic and went straight to his instinct. It was a scream, high-pitched and raw, vibrating with an agony that no grown man in his organization could ever replicate. The doors burst open. His guards, massive men built like stone walls, were trying to grab a small, frantic blur of a girl without hurting her. Amara Bennett was a whirlwind of soft brown hair and tear-streaked skin, her eyes wide and bloodshot from a terror that had reached its breaking point. She dodged a hand and lunged forward, her sneakers skidding on the hand-woven rug until she collapsed at the edge of Sebastian's desk. "Boss, we're sorry," she just. She came out of nowhere, one of the guards panted, his hand hovering near his holster. Sebastian didn't look at his men. He didn't even move his hand from the glass of bourbon resting on the desk. He leaned forward, the shadow of his brow masking his deeply set eyes. He took in the sight of her, the simple dress, the bruised knuckles where she'd clearly fought her way through, and the way her small frame shook. "They're beating my mama," she shrieked, the words tearing out of her throat. The sound echoed off the marble walls, making the hardened enforcers flinch. "Please." They said no one would help. They said the police are theirs. "They're hurting her so bad." Sebastian's jaw tightened. He recognized the cruelty she was describing before she even named the place. It was the Grand Estate, nearby, a fortress of new blood peacocks who thought that wealth granted them a license for sadism. They thought they were untouchable because they had bought the law, but they had forgotten that they hadn't bought him. He looked into Amara's eyes. She wasn't just crying, she was drowning. She reached out, her tiny, shaking hand catching the sleeve of his dark leather jacket. Most people would lose a hand for touching Sebastian Caruso without permission. He felt the heat of her desperation through the leather, a raw electricity that sparked a memory of a time before his heart had turned to stone. Sebastian stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate, and carried the weight of a mountain. He checked the chamber of his .45 with a metallic snick that sounded like a final judgment. He looked at his men, who stood frozen, waiting for a command. "Get the cars," Sebastian said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He looked back down at Amara, his expression unchanging, yet his eyes holding a new, terrible focus. "I'm on my way." The black SUVs didn't roar to life, they purred, a predatory hum that filled the underground garage of the Caruso estate. Sebastian stood by the lead vehicle, his eyes fixed on a digital topographical map projected onto a tablet held by his lead enforcer, Dante. The big house Amara had described wasn't just a residence. It was the Moretti stronghold, an opulent fortress tucked behind 12-foot iron gates and a sophisticated web of thermal sensors. The Morettis, Dante spat, his thumb tracing the perimeter of the estate. "They've been playing at being kings since they moved in last month. They think the high walls and the gold leaf make them untouchable. They've got at least 20 shooters on the grounds, boss. It's a literal cage." Sebastian looked at the flickering blue lines of the mansion's layout. He knew the type. The Morettis were new blood, loud, flashy, and devoid of the old-world honor that kept the street stable. They didn't just want territory, they wanted to inflict pain to prove they existed. To them, Serafina Bennett was a ghost, a nobody whose disappearance would be buried under a mountain of laundered cash and bought-off precinct captains. "They have her in the north wing," Sebastian said, his voice cold and analytical. He pointed to a grand, circular room with floor-to-ceiling glass that overlooked the cliffs. The grand room. It's where Moretti likes to hold court. He wants an audience for his cruelty. Boss, it's a suicide run to go through the front, Dante cautioned, checking the slide on his weapon. They have elevated positions on the balconies. We'd be fish in a barrel. Sebastian didn't argue. He wasn't a man of ego, he was a man of results. He reached into the SUV and pulled out a heavy tactical vest, cinching it over his leather jacket with practiced ease. He looked at Amara, who was being watched over by his house staff in the shadows of the garage. Her eyes were still fixed on him, desperate and searching. She had bypassed his security because she believed he was a god. He couldn't afford to be anything less. We don't go through the front, Sebastian decided, the plan snapping into place with the precision of a clockwork mechanism. The Morettas spent $3 million on security sensors, but they're arrogant. They rely on the tech to tell them when trouble is coming. We're going to give them a ghost story. He turned to the row of men, his family, who stood ready. These were men who had bled for him, who understood that in this city, you were either the hammer or the nail. Tonight, the Morettas learned the difference between having money and having power, Sebastian stated. He climbed into the back of the lead SUV, the interior light casting his chiseled features into sharp relief. They think that mansion is a fortress. By midnight, I want them to realize it's their tomb. Move out. The convoy pulled into a darkened alleyway 2 blocks from the Moretti perimeter, the engines idling in a low, synchronized growl. Inside the lead SUV, the air was thick with the scent of gun oil and the unspoken tension of men who knew how to count the cost of a single bullet. Dante broke the silence first. He was a veteran enforcer, a man who viewed the world through the lens of risk and reward. Boss, he began, his voice lowered so the younger men in the back wouldn't hear the doubt. We're about to kick a hornet's nest. The Morettas have friends in the Senate and half the precinct on their payroll. If we do this for a girl we don't know, for a woman who doesn't bring a dime to the table, it's going to start a fire we might not be able to put out. Is this really worth the heat? The other men in the vehicle shifted, their eyes darting toward Sebastian. They were loyal, but they were mercenaries at heart. They fought for the expansion of the Caruso name and the security of their own pockets. To them, Serafina Bennett was a ghost in the machinery of a city that ground people like her into dust every single day. Sebastian didn't answer immediately. He reached into the pocket of his leather jacket and pulled out a small, silver lighter, flicking the flame to life. The light danced in his deeply set eyes, highlighting the weathered lines of a man who had outlived almost all of his enemies. You think this is about profit, Dante? Sebastian asked, his voice a dry, dangerous rasp. You think our family is just a hedge fund with guns? He looked at the men around him, forcing each one to meet his gaze. We built this city on a promise. The police took the money and looked away. The politicians took the money and lied. But the people, the shopkeepers, the mothers, the kids on the street, they looked at the Caruso name and they knew there was a line. They knew that as long as we held the keys, there was a limit to the cruelty. He leaned forward, the shadows swallowing half his face. The Morettas aren't just breaking the law. They're breaking the balance. They think they can drag a woman into a room and break her bones for sport because she's a nobody. If we let them decide who matters and who doesn't, then we aren't kings. We're just scavengers waiting for our turn to be eaten. Sebastian's hand tightened around the grip of his .45. The casual ease was gone, replaced by a cold, righteous fury. I didn't give that girl my word because I wanted her money. I gave it because she was the only person in this zip code with enough heart to stand up to a monster. We aren't fighting for profit tonight. We're fighting so that when a child screams in this neighborhood, they know someone is coming. The confusion in the car evaporated, replaced by a grim, sharpened resolve. Dante nodded slowly, the doubt leaving his eyes. He checked his magazine one last time, the metallic click sounding like a seal of approval. "Understood, boss," Dante whispered. "What's the order?" Sebastian looked out the window at the looming silhouette of the Moretti fortress. "The order is simple. We're going to show them what happens when you bring your filth into my house." The transition from the sanctuary of the estate to the violence of the street was marked by the heavy, rhythmic thud of armored doors closing in unison. Sebastian sat in the rear of the lead SUV, the cabin bathed in the dim, red glow of the tactical lights. The atmosphere was no longer one of debate, it was the cold, pressurized silence of a weapon being drawn. Amara sat beside him, looking smaller than ever against the reinforced leather seating. She wasn't crying anymore, the terror had crystallized into a fragile, wide-eyed shock. Sebastian looked down at her, his chiseled face unreadable, yet he adjusted his heavy tactical vest so the harsh edges of the ceramic plates wouldn't graze her shoulder. "Look at me, Amara," Sebastian commanded softly. His voice was a low anchor in the hum of the high-speed engine. When she turned her tear-swollen eyes to him, he continued, "In a few minutes, the world is going to get very loud. My men are going to do their jobs. You will hear things that sound like thunder, and you will see lights that move too fast. When we get to that house, I want you to close your eyes. You don't open them until I tell you your mother is in this car. Do you understand?" Amara nodded, her small hands clutching the hem of her dress until her knuckles turned white. Sebastian reached out, his weathered hand hovering over hers for a brief second before he pulled back, reclaiming his, deliberately controlled, posture. He wasn't a father, and he wasn't a comforter. He was a shield. "Dante, time?" Sebastian asked, his eyes shifting to the digital clock on the dashboard. "4 minutes to the perimeter, boss," Dante replied, his hands steady on the steering wheel as he navigated the SUV through the rain-slicked backstreets at a lethal pace. "Rival sensors are already being jammed. The Ghost protocol is live." The city blurred past the tinted windows. A smear of neon lights and gray concrete that had no idea a storm was descending. Sebastian checked the chamber of his .45 one last time, the metallic click sounding like a final heartbeat. He knew what awaited them in the grand room of the Moretti estate. He knew the kind of filth that enjoyed lessons behind closed doors. He looked back at Amara. She was the only innocent thing in a 3-mile radius, a living reminder of why he had once cared about the rules of the neighborhood. "Close your eyes now, kid," he whispered as the SUV veered toward the rising silhouette of the Moretti fortress. "The war is here." Amara squeezed her eyes shut, burying her face against the rough leather of his jacket. Sebastian looked forward, his gaze turning to ice as the iron gates of the mansion came into view. The 10-minute war wasn't just about a rescue, it was about erasing a mistake. The Moretti estate was a monument to arrogance, a sprawling palace of glass and gold that looked down on the city like a god. But as the Caruso convoy hit the perimeter, the fortress became a cage. Sebastian didn't bother with the front gate, he knew the Morettis relied on their thermal grid and their paid-off guards, but they hadn't accounted for the ghosts Sebastian had spent decades training. The first breach was silent. Dante and a 4-man team disabled the exterior sensors with a localized pulse, and before the Moretti security could even blink at their monitors, Sebastian was already on the gravel path. He moved with a terrifying, casual ease, his dark leather jacket blending into the shadows of the manicured hedges. He didn't crouch, he didn't scramble. He walked with the rhythmic, steady pace of a man who had already decided he was going to live, and everyone else in the building was already dead. A guard emerged from a side terrace, his radio halfway to his lips. Sebastian didn't break his stride. In one fluid motion, he raised his suppressed .45, the weapon looking like an extension of his own arm. There was a faint thwip-thwip, and the guard folded into the ivy without a sound. Sebastian didn't even look at the body. His eyes were fixed on the north wing, where the light from the grand room spilled out onto the lawn like an open wound. "Phase 2, Sebastian whispered into his comms. Suddenly, the night erupted. A secondary Caruso team launched a diversionary strike at the main gate, drawing the bulk of the Moretti shooters toward the front. In the chaos of sirens and shouting, Sebastian moved toward the glass doors of the north wing. He was a shark in dark water, gliding past the frantic security details that were running in the wrong direction. He reached the heavy glass doors of the conservatory. Inside, he could see the opulence. The crystal chandeliers, the velvet curtains, and the men in silk suits who thought that hurting a woman made them powerful. Sebastian paused for a fraction of a second, his reflection caught in the glass. He looked stone-cold, his chiseled jaw set, his eyes carrying the weight of 1,000 sins he was about to atone for. He didn't knock. He kicked the doors off their hinges with a force that shattered the glass into 1,000,000 diamonds. The sound was a thunderclap that silenced the music and the laughter inside. As he stepped into the light, the Moretti soldiers scrambled for their weapons, their faces contorted in a mix of confusion and primal fear. They had expected a rival gang, they hadn't expected the Reaper himself. "I told the girl I was on my way," Sebastian said, his voice a low, terrifying growl that cut through the panic. "I'd hate to make her a liar." The grand room was a cavern of white marble and hollow luxury, but the air inside tasted of copper and cowardice. At the center of the vast space, beneath a chandelier that cast jagged, mocking light, Serafina Bennett was slumped in a gilded chair. Her silhouette was a broken contrast to the opulence around her, her hair matted, her spirit flickering like a dying candle. Standing over her was Lorenzo Moretti, a man who wore his power like a stolen suit. He held a heavy, silver-plated revolver, the barrel pressed firmly against Serafina's temple. He was smiling, a thin, oily expression of a man who thought he had won. "You're late, Caruso," Lorenzo sneered, his eyes darting toward the shattered conservatory doors. "One more step and the girl becomes an orphan. This is business. She's the collateral for the respect you didn't show us." Sebastian stood 20 feet away, his .45 held at his side with that terrifying, casual ease. But for the first time in 20 years, the stone-cold mask began to crack. He wasn't looking at Lorenzo, he was looking at the way Serafina's eyes were squeezed shut, the way she was whispering a name, Amara, over and over. The calculated ruthlessness that had defined Sebastian's life suddenly evaporated, replaced by a white-hot, tectonic rage. "Business?" Sebastian's voice didn't rumble this time, it hissed like a fuse. "You think dragging a mother from her kitchen is business? You think making a 7-year-old scream until her throat bleeds is business? She's a nobody, Sebastian. Don't lose your empire over a—" Lorenzo never finished the sentence. Sebastian moved. It wasn't the movement of a man, it was the strike of a predator that had finally lost its patience. He didn't fire his weapon immediately. He lunged across the marble floor, closing the distance with a speed that defied his age. Lorenzo panicked, his finger tightening on the trigger, but Sebastian was already there. With a roar of pure, primal fury, Sebastian grabbed Lorenzo's wrist, the sound of snapping bone echoing through the cavernous room. The silver revolver clattered to the floor. Sebastian didn't stop. He slammed Lorenzo against a marble pillar, his hand tightening around the man's throat until the rival's face turned a bruised purple. "You called her a nobody," Sebastian growled, his face inches from Lorenzo's, his eyes burning with a fire that made the other man's blood run cold. "In my city, no one is a nobody. Especially not the mother of the girl who had the courage to look me in the eye when you were too busy hiding behind your walls." That deliberately controlled boss was gone. In his place stood a man who was no longer deciding what happened next, he was executing it. With a final, crushing blow, Sebastian silenced the threat, letting Lorenzo's limp form slide down the pillar into the shadows where he belonged. Sebastian turned, his chest heaving, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. He looked at Serafina, who was staring at him in a daze of terror and relief. He reached out, his hand shaking slightly as he untied the rough cords binding her wrists. "It's over," he whispered, his voice cracking with a rare, raw humanity. "Amara is waiting." I told her I was on my way, and I don't break my word. The grand room was a wreck of shattered crystal and broken glass, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and the ozone of the estate's failing security system. Sebastian holstered his .45 with a heavy, final metallic clack. The rage that had fueled his movements was receding, leaving behind a cold, somber clarity. He looked down at Serafina. She was trembling so violently she couldn't stand, her strength having vanished the moment the immediate threat died. Without a word, Sebastian knelt. He didn't ask her to walk, he didn't wait for his men to fetch a stretcher. He slid one powerful arm beneath her knees and the other behind her back, lifting her with the same ease he used to carry the weight of his empire. Her head fell against his shoulder, her breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches against his dark leather jacket. "I've got you," he muttered, his voice a low vibration. "The nightmare is over." As he stepped out over the threshold of the north wing, the Caruso convoy was waiting. The diversionary team had finished their work, the Moretti fortress was silent, its untouchable status burned to the ground in less than 20 minutes. Dante held the door of the lead SUV open, his face grim as he took in the sight of the boss carrying a nobody like she was the most precious cargo in the city. But the real shift happened when they reached the sanctuary of the Caruso garage. The heavy doors groaned upward, and there she was, Amara. She had broken away from the staff the moment the headlights swept across the concrete. As Sebastian stepped out of the vehicle, still carrying Serafina, Amara didn't hesitate. She didn't look at the blood on his knuckles or the tactical gear strapped to his chest. She saw only her mother. "Mama!" The cry was small, but it filled the vast space. Sebastian lowered Serafina to her feet, supporting her weight until she could sink to her knees to meet her daughter. The two of them collided in a heap of tears and whispered prayers. Sebastian stood over them, a towering shadow of leather and iron, his expression returning to its stone-cold mask. Suddenly, a small, warm pressure latched onto his side. He looked down to find Amara clutching the hem of his dark leather jacket with both hands, her face buried against his hip. She wasn't just hugging him, she was anchoring herself to him, her small frame finally still now that her world had been stitched back together. Sebastian froze. He was a man who lived by the gun and died by the word, a man who dealt in the currency of fear. But as he looked down at the little girl clutching his coat, he didn't pull away. He simply placed a heavy, weathered hand on Amara's head, his fingers tangling briefly in her soft brown hair. "You were brave, kid," he said quietly. "You saved her." The aftermath of the raid didn't end with the dawn, it solidified into a new, terrifying reality for the city's underworld. Word had spread through the back alleys and high-rise penthouses before the sun was even fully over the horizon. Sebastian Caruso hadn't just neutralized a rival, he had gone to war for a woman with no last name and a child with no pedigree. 2 days later, the leaders of the city's most influential families were summoned to the back room of a quiet, nondescript social club. The air was thick with the smell of espresso and the heavy, nervous silence of men who knew that the rules of the city had changed while they were sleeping. Sebastian sat at the head of the long, scarred table. He wasn't wearing his tactical gear or his leather jacket. He was in a sharp, charcoal suit, his salt and pepper hair perfectly groomed, his expression back to that of a man who decided the weather. He looked every bit the powerful kingpin, radiating a quiet, dangerous authority that made the younger capos at the table break out in a cold sweat. "I didn't bring you here to talk about percentages," Sebastian began, his voice a low, sandpaper rasp that carried to every corner of the room. He didn't raise his voice, yet the room seemed to shrink around it. "I brought you here to explain a new law in this territory." He leaned forward, his deeply set eyes locking onto each man in turn. "The Bennetts, Serafina and her daughter, Amara, are now under my personal protection. They aren't associates. They aren't business. They are blood. My blood." A murmur of confusion rippled through the table. To declare a non-Italian family with no criminal ties as blood was a radical departure from tradition. It was an elevation that carried the full weight of the Caruso family's resources. "What does that mean for us, Sebastian?" one of the older bosses asked, his voice cautious. "They're just civilians." Sebastian's jaw tightened, his chiseled features turning to stone. "It means," he said, the words falling like iron weights, "that if a hair on their heads is harmed, if their landlord raises their rent unfairly, if a car even splashes mud on that girl's dress while she's walking to school, I will treat it as an assassination attempt on me." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a stack of business cards, the same simple ones he had given Serafina. He slid them across the table. "I have placed an iron dome over their apartment. My men will be on their street 24 hours a day. But I'm also holding all of you responsible. If anything happens to them in your sectors, I won't ask for an explanation. I will simply come for you." The message was unmistakable. Sebastian wasn't just being a guardian, he was using the Bennett family as a litmus test for his own power. He was proving that his word was stronger than the law. "The Morettas thought they could hunt in my woods," Sebastian finished, standing up and buttoning his jacket with a slow, deliberate grace. "They found out too late that the woods belonged to the wolf. Don't make the same mistake." As he walked out, his enforcers flanking him like shadows, the men at the table looked at the business cards. They understood. Serafina and Amara Bennett were no longer the most vulnerable people in the city. They were the most untouchable. 6 months had passed, and the city breathed with a different rhythm. The sharp, jagged edges of fear that once defined the neighborhood had smoothed into something more substantial, a quiet, watchful order. The Moretti mansion remained a blackened shell on the hill, a skeletal reminder that some lines, once crossed, could never be redrawn. Sebastian Caruso sat at his usual table at the back of the social club, the morning sun cutting through the dust motes in the air. He was still a man of iron and shadow, his power absolute and his reach unchallenged. But he was no longer just a ghost that people prayed would stay in the dark. He had become something far more complex, a guardian whose authority was rooted in the memory of a single night. The heavy door chimed, and a familiar, light pitter-patter of feet echoed against the floorboards. Sebastian didn't look up from his newspaper, but the corners of his mouth twitched. A movement so subtle his own men would have missed it. Amara Bennett walked straight past the front desk, past the armed enforcers who now stepped aside with respectful nods, and stopped at the edge of the mahogany table. She was taller now, her hair neatly braided, her face free of the tear streaks that had first introduced her to the underworld. In her hand, she held a small, plastic container of homemade cookies and a report card with a bright gold star at the top. "Mama said to bring these," she said, her voice clear and no longer trembling. "And I got an A in history." Sebastian lowered the paper, his deeply set eyes softening as they landed on the girl. He didn't offer a grandfatherly smile, he wasn't that kind of man, but he took the container with a solemn nod of appreciation. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small, silver coin, a custom token he had minted for his highest-ranking captains, and slid it across the table toward her. "History is important, kid," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "It's how we remember who we are so we don't repeat the mistakes of people who were smaller than us." Amara pocketed the coin with a grin, a secret bond passing between the mafia boss and the child who had shattered his silence. She knew, even if she didn't fully understand the politics of the city, that she was walking through a world made safe specifically for her. As she turned to leave, Sebastian watched her go. He looked at his hands, weathered, scarred, and familiar with violence, and then at the report card she had left for him to see. He had spent decades building an empire of fear, thinking that was the only way to survive. But in the quiet peace of the morning, he realized that the loudest thing he had ever done wasn't the gunfire at the Moretti estate, it was the moment he had looked into the eyes of a terrified child and decided to be exactly who she needed him to be. Sebastian Caruso was still the boss. He was still the wolf. But as the sun warmed the room, he picked up his paper and felt a rare, heavy sense of satisfaction. The neighborhood was quiet, the Bennetts were safe, and for the first time in his life, the ghosts didn't follow him home.